Hey everyone, today we're stepping back into the 1960s and 1970s when the family supper hour could organize an entire house. A wall clock ticked above the Formica counter, a pot of potatoes steamed beside an electric range, and children were called in from bicycles and backyards before the porch light came on. Dinner was not simply food placed somewhere between afternoon and bedtime. In many homes it was the evening's fixed point, and everyone else was expected to move around it. The meal might begin at 5:36 or later, depending on a parent's job, a farm schedule, a factory shift, or the distance home from work. What mattered was not one universal hour, but the expectation that supper had an hour at all. Today we're remembering 20 family dinner traditions that became less central after the 1970s, beginning with the clock that told a household when the day had changed from work and play into family time. If stories about forgotten American foods, kitchen routines, and family traditions bring back a familiar room, you're welcome to like the video and subscribe to Forgotten American Home. Which supper time tradition do you remember most clearly, and what dish did your family expect to see on the table on an ordinary weeknight? For this list, a tradition must be more than a recipe. It must be a repeated action expectation, or small ceremony that shaped how families gathered and ate. The first was the fixed supper hour. Long before a phone could send a message to every family member, the kitchen clock did most of the announcing. A mother might begin peeling potatoes at 4:30 because the roast needed another hour. A child playing 2 houses away knew that a certain porch light whistle bell or shouted name meant it was time to run home. The routine could feel strict, but it also made dinner predictable in a world without individual calendars glowing in every pocket. The supper hour usually began long before anyone sat down. In a bright 1960s, kitchen cans were opened, frozen vegetables rattled into a saucepan, and meat browned while a radio played near the refrigerator. By the 1970s, the kitchen might be harvest gold or avocado green with a slow cooker on the counter and a coupon envelope tucked beside the bread box. Someone still had to calculate backward from the expected mealtime. If dinner was at 6, the casserole went into the oven at 5:15. If biscuits were involved, they waited until the last few minutes. If a parent worked late, the potatoes might be covered, the gravy thinned, and the whole schedule stretched without being abandoned. Convenience products promised to save time, but they rarely removed the need for timing. A boxed meal could shorten preparation, yet someone still had to brown the meat, measure the liquid, stir the pan, set the table, and decide whether the green beans could survive another 10 minutes. The package helped, the clock remained in charge. For children, the fixed hour created a boundary between the freedom of the afternoon and the order of the evening. Homework might be unfinished, a baseball game might be tied, or a bicycle chain might have just come off 2 blocks away, but dinner did not always negotiate. The call came through a screen door across an apartment hallway down basement stairs, or from a kitchen window facing the yard. In some neighborhoods, several parents seemed to call at once, and the street emptied with surprising efficiency. Shoes scraped the back steps, hands were washed. A comic book was left face down on the sofa. Even children who complained knew the pattern. This did not mean every household enjoyed peaceful meals, or that every parent arrived on time. Shift workers, single parents, military families, farmers and families with long commutes often built different routines. Still, in many homes, having a recognized supper hour gave the evening a shape. You knew when to be present when the food would be hot, and when the questions about school were likely to begin. The fixed meal time also reflected the kind of dinner being served. A pot roast, baked chicken, meatloaf, bean stew, or casserole could not be assembled separately for every person at a different hour, without losing texture, warmth, or the patience of the cook. These foods were designed to arrive together. Potatoes waited in one bowl, vegetables waited in another. bread sat under a folded towel and milk or iced tea was poured just before everyone sat down. The meal was often planned around economy as much as tradition. One oven, one main dish, and one round of clean-up used less fuel, less time, and fewer pans than feeding people in shifts. The supper hour made practical sense when the household depended on a single kitchen, and the person preparing dinner was also managing laundry, children errands, and the next day's lunch. The ritual may look leisurely in old photographs, but the work behind it was usually moving quickly. Family togetherness was real for many people. So was the person checking the oven while everyone else asked when dinner would be ready. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, the fixed supper hour began to loosen in many households, although it never disappeared completely. Longer commutes, changing work patterns, after-school sports, evening jobs, take-out expanded restaurant options, frozen meals, and eventually microwave reheating made it easier for family members to eat at different times. The change was gradual. First one plate was kept warm, then one child ate early before practice. Another parent ate later after work. A meal that had once gathered the whole house became a series of individual arrivals, each opening the refrigerator and asking what was left. That flexibility solved real problems, especially for busy households, but it changed the sound of the evening. Fewer chairs scraped the floor at once. Fewer serving bowls arrived together. The clock above the kitchen door still ticked, but it no longer commanded everyone in the same way. And once the hour stopped gathering the family, the next tradition became harder to maintain waiting until every chair was filled before anyone began. An empty chair could delay an entire meal. The potatoes were already mashed, the green beans had begun losing their brightness, and a thin skin might be forming across the gravy. But in many households, the first fork still did not move until the missing person came through the door. Waiting for everyone was not always announced as a special tradition. It was simply understood. A parent might stand at the stove with one hand on the saucepan lid, listening for a car in the driveway. Children watched the clock, then the serving bowls, then the door, quietly estimating how long fried chicken could remain crisp beneath a sheet of foil. Sometimes the absent family member was only washing up or finishing a telephone call. Sometimes a bus was late, a factory whistle had sounded later than expected, or traffic had slowed a commuter several miles from home. The food waited because the meal was supposed to begin as one event. Eating was individual. Beginning dinner belonged to the family. The tradition carried a simple message: your presence mattered to the shape of the evening. A chair was not merely furniture pushed beneath a dining table. It represented the person expected to fill it, whether that was a father returning from work, a mother finishing a late shift, a teenager walking home from practice, or a grandparent coming downstairs slowly. In some homes, children were allowed bread or a glass of milk while they waited. In stricter households, even that counted as beginning early. A serving spoon rested untouched in the potatoes and the butter softened patiently in its dish. Hunger made every sound from the kitchen seem louder. The refrigerator motor started. The clock advanced another minute. Someone asked when the missing person would arrive and received the familiar answer that dinner would begin soon. Soon could last long enough for the peas to become educational. Yet the delay also reinforced the idea that the family meal was not a cafeteria line. Everyone's arrival transformed prepared food into dinner. Waiting could require careful kitchen management. A roast could remain warm in the oven, but biscuits became dry. Gravy thickened. A casserole that looked perfect at 6 might develop a darker edge by 6:15. The person who cooked often performed small acts of rescue while pretending nothing was wrong. A spoonful of water went into the vegetables. The burner beneath the potatoes was turned as low as possible. Meat was covered, uncovered, and covered again. In summer, a cold salad waited more easily. although mayonnaise-based dishes brought their own concerns. In winter, soup and stew were more forgiving, which may be one reason they suited households with uncertain arrival times. The expectation of togetherness therefore shaped not only manners but menus. Foods that could hold their warmth, survive a delay, or be reheated without complaint had a practical advantage. A family might remember waiting as a moral lesson in patience. The cook remembered it as a technical problem involving several lids and steadily declining optimism. Not every family could wait, and not every missing chair was filled by someone returning from an ordinary workday. Factory shifts, hospital hours, military duty, farm chores, restaurant work, long-distance trucking and evening employment created households with several different supper times. Single parents often had to balance dinner against commuting childcare and exhaustion. Some families served the children first and kept a plate warm for an adult arriving later. Others treated whoever was present as the evening family and began without apology. Even in homes that valued a shared meal, reality regularly interrupted the ideal. That difference matters because magazine illustrations and advertisements often presented dinner as a complete group gathered calmly around a spotless table. Real kitchens contained late buses, broken machinery, overtime, sick children, and people who simply could not be there. The tradition was powerful, partly because it was not always easy. Waiting expressed a hope that the household could be gathered even when schedules and circumstances repeatedly proved otherwise. When the missing person finally arrived, the room changed quickly. A coat landed on a chair, backwork shoes crossed the kitchen floor, and a brief apology was sometimes accepted before anyone asked for an explanation. Serving bowls began moving almost at once. The person who had waited longest might now be told not to take too much. In some homes, the late arrival received the first portion because everyone knew the day had been difficult. In others, the meal began with a prayer, a nod, or the simple instruction to pass the meat. The delay was rarely discussed for long because hot food had its own urgency. Children who had spent 10 minutes complaining now ate with remarkable concentration. Adults exchanged the first pieces of news from work or school. The previously empty chair became part of the table again, and the household briefly matched the picture it had been trying to create. That moment of completion is what many people remember, more than the temperature of the vegetables. By the late 1970s and into the decades that followed, waiting for every chair became harder to defend against increasingly complicated schedules. One child had practice, another had a part-time job, a parent worked late, and someone else could reheat a plate later. Frozen entrees, takeout containers, and eventually routine microwave use made separate mealtimes more practical. Flexibility reduced stress and prevented hungry children from staring resentfully at a cooling casserole. It also changed the meaning of the empty chair. Instead of delaying dinner, the household simply moved around it. A plate was covered and placed in the refrigerator. A note might be left on the counter. The family member arriving later could eat, but would miss the exact moment when the bowls first opened and the day's conversation began. Before anyone could occupy those expected seats, however, another small ritual usually came first. Children entering from the yard, basement, garage, or neighborhood were sent toward the sink because the family table expected clean hands, even when the rest of the child had clearly lost the argument. The screen door slammed, sneakers scraped across the back step, and a voice from the kitchen delivered the same instruction heard in countless homes: wash your hands before supper. Children came indoors carrying the visible evidence of the afternoon. There was dust from the vacant lot, grass on the knees, bicycle grease on one finger, chalk from the sidewalk, and sometimes a mysterious dark mark no one could explain. In summer, the smell of warm pavement and sun-dried clothes followed them into the kitchen. In winter, wet mittens landed near a radiator while snow softened around the edges of rubber boots. The meal might already be waiting beneath foil, but the child was not yet ready for the table. Between the yard and the dining room stood a small domestic checkpoint, the sink a bar of soap, and an adult prepared to decide whether the washing had been convincing. The routine began when someone called the children home. In a suburban neighbourhood, a mother might lean through a kitchen door and shout a name across 2 yards. In an apartment building, the message travelled down a hallway or through an open window. Rural children might be finishing chores, closing a gate, or carrying something in from the garden. The distance was different, but the transition was similar. Outdoor play ended abruptly. Baseball gloves were dropped on porch benches. Jump ropes were coiled badly and left for someone else to notice. Bicycles were laid in the grass with the confidence that gravity would put them away. A child who had spent an hour avoiding capture during a game of tag could become remarkably difficult to locate when dinner was announced. Still, the smell of frying onions, baked chicken, or tomato sauce usually provided additional persuasion. Supper called through the air before the parent did. At the sink, speed competed with inspection. A quick splash of water might satisfy the child, but rarely the adult standing nearby. Soap had to appear. Fingers had to be rubbed together. The backs of the hands, often forgotten, received special attention when dirt remained visible. Fingernails presented a more serious problem, especially after digging in a garden, building roads in a sandbox, or repairing a bicycle without possessing either tools or permission. Some homes kept a nail brush near the faucet. Others relied on a washcloth whose original colour had become difficult to determine. The towel hung from a cabinet handle, a metal ring, or the oven door, and children were reminded not to dry dirty hands on it before completing the washing. This was not a formal lesson in public health so much as a repeated household expectation. Whatever had happened outside should not be transferred directly to the bread basket. Sometimes hands were only the beginning. A child arriving with mud on the legs might be sent to the bathroom. A sweaty shirt could require changing, particularly when company was present, or when the family treated the evening meal with more formality. Hair was smoothed. Faces were wiped around the mouth and forehead. Boys and girls who had spent the afternoon climbing trees, helping in a garage, feeding animals, or racing through sprinklers were briefly restored to dinner table condition. The standard was not always perfect cleanliness. It was evidence of effort. A damp face and hastily combed hair showed that the child understood the boundary between play and supper, even when one ear remained suspiciously dusty. In many households, the transformation also involved removing hats, jackets, baseball caps, or work gloves before entering the dining area. The table was a shared surface, and the body brought to it was expected to acknowledge that fact. The practice also reflected the physical world of childhood before much outdoor play became scheduled and supervised. Children often spent long stretches beyond the kitchen, moving among yards, sidewalks, alleys, fields, garages, creeks, and unfinished construction areas. They handled stones, insects, pets, garden soil, sports equipment, and whatever object seemed capable of becoming a fort. By dinner, hands could carry paint sap rust dust, or the faint smell of a dog that had participated enthusiastically in the afternoon. Parents did not need a scientific lecture to see the problem. They saw the black line beneath a fingernail approaching the mashed potatoes. Washing before supper became part hygiene, part manners, and part reset. It told the child that family dinner required a different behaviour from the freedom outside. The person who had been shouting across a vacant lot 10 minutes earlier was now expected to sit upright, pass the vegetables, and avoid explaining how the torn sleeve had happened until everyone had eaten. The ritual could also expose the household's division of labour. The person cooking dinner was often the same person checking hands, finding clean shirts, hanging wet coats, and asking why the soap remained dry. Supper did not pause while these inspections occurred. A saucepan still needed stirring. Rolls needed removing from the oven. A younger child might require actual washing rather than verbal encouragement. Older siblings were sometimes told to help, creating an inspection system of questionable fairness. In crowded households, several children competed for one bathroom sink, while someone pounded on the door and warned that dinner was getting cold. The routine looked small, but it connected outdoor childhood household order, sanitation, clothing care, and the cook's schedule. A meal could not begin until the food and the family were ready at the same time, a coordination problem far more complicated than old advertisements usually admitted. As evenings became more fragmented, this formal transition from outdoor play to the table weakened in many homes. Children came home for separate meals, ate before activities, or carried food into rooms where no one examined their hands. Organized sports replaced some neighborhood play, and changing schedules reduced the moment when every child entered through the same door at once. Yet the memory remains unusually sharp. The sink running the rough bar of soap, the towel already damp, and the adult who could somehow detect dirt without looking directly at it. Once the children were clean enough to sit down, the family still did not always begin immediately. In many homes, the next moment belonged to a brief silence, bowed heads, folded hands, or familiar words spoken before anyone touched the food. For a few seconds, the room became quieter than it had been all evening. Serving spoons rested inside bowls, glasses stood untouched, and even a child staring directly at the fried chicken was expected to wait. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, dinner began with grace, a short prayer of thanks spoken before the first bite. Heads bowed, hands folded, and the ordinary noise of the kitchen paused beneath the ticking wall clock and the hum of the refrigerator. The words could be formal, memorized, improvised, sung, or reduced to one familiar sentence repeated so often that children could recite it while thinking entirely about dessert. For religious families, grace acknowledged God, food work, and the people gathered at the table. For children, it also marked the final obstacle between an empty plate and a full one. The prayer might last only half a minute, but it changed the meal from food that happened to be ready into something the household officially began together. The exact ritual varied widely. In some Protestant homes, one parent offered a spontaneous prayer that mentioned the meal family members' absent relatives and anyone known to be ill. In others, everyone repeated the same blessing each night. Catholic families might make the sign of the cross before and after familiar words, while Jewish households followed distinct blessings and Sabbath traditions shaped by religious practice, family background, and the particular meal. Some families sang grace, especially at church gatherings, camps, or tables filled with young children. Others simply lowered their heads while the oldest person spoke. Many American households did not pray at dinner at all, and some replaced religious language with a quiet expression of gratitude. The practice could differ even between neighboring homes. A child eating at a friend's house learned quickly whether to bow, hold hands, remain silent, or watch discreetly until everyone else moved. Table manners were usually taught in advance. Grace sometimes had to be learned in real time. The person chosen to speak could reveal the family structure. A father might lead the prayer, particularly in households where religious authority followed traditional gender roles. A mother might speak because she had prepared the meal, guided the children, or was simply the person who remembered that everyone had nearly started without it. Grandparents were often invited to lead when visiting, and children might take turns as part of religious instruction. The youngest child occasionally delivered a memorized blessing at great speed, pronouncing every word as though the vegetables were actively escaping. Older children could be asked to give thanks in their own words, which introduced the dangerous possibility of silence, embarrassment, and sudden theological creativity. Yet these small assignments gave children a visible place in the ritual. They were not only being fed, they were being taught how the family described gratitude, responsibility, abundance and dependence, even if their immediate concern was whether the gravy would reach them before it cooled. Grace also made the work behind dinner briefly visible, although not always explicitly. A table might hold meatloaf, canned peas, mashed potatoes, sliced bread and milk, none of it luxurious, yet each item had required wages, shopping, planning, cooking and cleanup. For families living carefully between paychecks, giving thanks did not mean pretending the meal had appeared easily. It could recognize that there was enough for everyone that evening. In farming households, the prayer might carry an obvious connection to Weathercrop's livestock and the uncertainty of the season. In working-class homes, it could follow a day of factory labour service work or long travel. The person who cooked might still be standing for part of it, remembering the butter in the refrigerator or the pan left on a warm burner. Old illustrations often showed a calm family bowing around a perfectly arranged table. Real grace sometimes occurred while a baby cried. A dog scratched at the door and someone whispered that the rolls were burning. Children learned that the prayer required stillness, but childhood still found ways to enter. One eye opened to see whether anyone else was watching. A sibling squeezed another hand too hard when the family held hands around the table. Someone began eating early and then attempted to disguise the evidence. A prayer spoken too slowly could feel like an endurance test when steam rose from a favourite dish. Yet even these minor struggles reinforced the boundary. The food was present, but the meal had not begun. In households where grace was taken seriously, reaching for a biscuit before amen could produce a look more effective than a speech. In more relaxed homes, the interruption became a small joke. The ritual combined reverence with domestic reality. It was solemn, but it occurred beside chipped plates, paper napkins, canned vegetables, and a child who had forgotten to remove a baseball cap. That mixture is why many people remember it so clearly. By the late 1970s and afterward, grace changed along with the family meal itself. It survived strongly in many religious homes but became less automatic across the broader culture. As households grew more religiously diverse, schedules fragmented, and meals were eaten in separate rooms or at separate times. A prayer was easier to maintain when everyone began together. It became more difficult when one person ate before practice, another reheated dinner later, and someone else carried a plate toward the television. Some families preserved the ritual on Sundays, holidays, or when grandparents visited even after abandoning it on ordinary weeknights. Others replaced spoken prayer with a brief moment of thanks, while some let the tradition disappear without any formal decision. This silence before the first bite may have lasted only seconds, but it depended on a complete table. And at that table each person usually knew exactly where to sit, because the next tradition was not written on a place card. It was built into the chairs themselves. The chair was rarely labelled, but everyone knew who belonged in it. At an ordinary family table in the 1960s or 1970s, people often returned to the same places night after night, until the arrangement felt less like a choice than part of the furniture. One child sat nearest the kitchen door. Another occupied the side facing the window. A grandparent might have the chair with the firmest back, while the youngest child was placed where spilled milk could be reached quickly. In some households, a father sat at the head of the table. In others, that position belonged to the person who served the food, needed the easiest path to the stove, or simply claimed the chair years earlier and never surrendered it. No place cards were required. The family carried the map in memory. A visitor who sat in the wrong chair might discover the mistake only when everyone paused, exchanged glances, and began the delicate process of pretending it did not matter. The seating arrangement usually grew from practical needs before becoming tradition. The person responsible for dinner often sat closest to the kitchen, because meals rarely remained complete once everyone was seated. Someone needed more milk. The butter had been forgotten. A spoon was missing. The gravy required rescue from the stove. Sitting near the doorway saved a few steps, although it also meant that the same person rose repeatedly while everyone else continued eating. A child who needed help cutting meat might sit beside an adult. Left-handed family members sometimes occupied a corner to prevent elbows from colliding through the entire meal. A baby's high chair stood where dropped food could be collected without dismantling the room. In cramped kitchens, seating depended on which chair could fit without blocking the refrigerator. These decisions were sensible, but repetition transformed them. After enough evenings, the seat no longer belonged to the task. It belonged to the person. A fixed chair also reflected the quiet hierarchy of the household. The most comfortable place, the head of the table or the seat with the clearest view of everyone, could suggest authority, although family customs varied far too widely for one pattern to describe every American home. Some fathers carved the roast or began the conversation from one end of the table. Some mothers controlled the meal from the chair nearest the serving dishes, noticing empty glasses and unfinished vegetables before anyone else did. Grandparents might receive a place of respect, especially during Sunday dinners or extended visits. Children were usually arranged according to age behavior and the likelihood of conflict. Two siblings who could turn a bread basket into a territorial dispute were separated for the public good. The child who kicked under the table was moved farther away. Seating could therefore become a form of household diplomacy, conducted with wooden chairs and no official announcement. For children, the assigned place created both security and limitation. The same section of table appeared each evening marked by familiar scratches, the edge of a placemat or a view of the kitchen clock. From that chair, a child learned where the serving bowls would arrive, which adult was most likely to permit a second roll, and how far the dessert sat from immediate reach. The place could feel comforting because it confirmed membership. Even after an argument, a bad report card, or a punishment, the chair still waited. At the same time, moving seats could feel strangely important. A child promoted from a booster seat to a regular chair had crossed a small domestic border. Being allowed to sit with the adults during a holiday gathering carried even greater significance. At crowded family meals, younger children might be sent to a card table in the kitchen or den where paper plates, folding chairs, and looser conversation created an entirely separate republic. The tradition became especially visible when company arrived. An extra leaf was placed in the table, folding chairs came from a closet, and the ordinary seating map had to be redrawn. Family members were told to move over trade places or give a better chair to a guest. The person who normally sat at the head might remain there while everyone else shifted one position, and spent the meal reaching automatically toward objects no longer beside them. Children often noticed the disruption immediately. Their usual view was gone. The salt had moved. A cousin now occupied the chair that had seemed permanently theirs. Yet hospitality required adjustment. A guest might be seated beside the person most likely to keep conversation moving or farthest from a drafty window. An elderly relative received a stable chair rather than a folding one. Even this temporary rearrangement revealed how settled the ordinary pattern had become. People discovered the strength of a habit when someone else was sitting inside it. The chair also accumulated memory. It was where a parent opened the evening newspaper before supper, where a child hid peas beneath the rim of a plate where homework was discussed. Birthdays were celebrated and difficult family news was delivered. The wooden back might hold a sweater. A vinyl seat could crack along the same edge year after year. One chair squeaked whenever its owner leaned back, announcing a violation of table manners before anyone spoke. When a family member was away at college, in the military, working a late shift, or no longer living at home, the empty place could feel more noticeable, because it had been so consistently occupied. The chair did not need a photograph or nameplate to carry someone's presence. Its position at the table had recorded thousands of ordinary meals, which is often how family memory works. The important objects are not always valuable. They are simply the ones that stayed in the same place while life happened around them. As family meals became less formal and less synchronized, assigned seats loosened in many homes. People ate at kitchen islands, breakfast bars, folding trays, desks, or couches. A child arriving early took whatever chair was open. A parent reheating dinner later might stand at the counter rather than recreate the table for one person. Open-plan rooms and larger kitchen spaces made seating more flexible, while separate schedules made the old map less necessary. Yet many families still discover that the tradition has not completely disappeared. Gather everyone for a holiday meal, and people often drift toward the places they occupied years before. The arrangement returns almost without discussion. Once each person had settled into the familiar chair, the table itself still required preparation. Forks, glasses, napkins, plates, salt and pepper had to appear in their proper places, because even an ordinary weeknight meal was expected to look like dinner before anyone began to eat. Before anyone sat down, the table had to look as though a meal was expected. Plates were placed in front of each chair, forks went to one side, knives and spoons to the other, and drinking glasses waited above the reach of careless elbows. Napkins might be folded beside the forks, tucked beneath them, or placed directly on the plates. Salt and pepper stood near the centre, often in mismatched shakers that had survived longer than the dishes around them. None of this required fine china. An ordinary weeknight table might use durable plates with faded flowers, plastic tumblers, paper napkins and silverware collected from more than one pattern. What mattered was the arrangement. Setting the table turned a bare surface into a place where the household was expected to gather. It announced that dinner would be eaten together, not simply discovered in a pan whenever someone became hungry. The job often belonged to children, which made table setting one of the first household duties they learned. A parent could continue stirring gravy or checking the oven, while a child counted plates from the cupboard. The work sounded easy until the table contained 6 people, one missing fork, a chipped glass that could not be used, and a younger sibling who insisted on helping by moving everything already placed correctly. Children learned the number of family members through dishes. They learned which adult wanted a spoon for coffee, who needed a steak knife, and which glass was less likely to tip beside the youngest child. Directions were repeated until they became automatic fork on the left knife blade facing inward napkin beside the plate. Not every household followed formal etiquette, and many families cared more about having enough utensils than arranging them properly. Still, the routine gave children a small role in preparing the meal before they were old enough to cook it. The ordinary table also reflected the household's level of formality. In some homes, a vinyl tablecloth remained in place all week, easy to wipe after spilled milk or tomato sauce. Others used woven placemats, a clean cloth or no covering at all. A centerpiece might be as simple as a bowl of fruit, a small vase, or the sugar bowl left from breakfast. Families with a separate dining room often saved it for Sundays, holidays, or company, while weekday meals took place in the kitchen beneath a hanging light. Apartments, farmhouses, suburban ranch homes, and crowded city houses all created different arrangements. Some families ate around a full dining table. Others squeezed around a small chrome-edged kitchen set with a chair added at the corner. The practice was never identical, but the visual message was similar. Plates in a row meant that the meal belonged to named people. The table had been prepared for everyone before anyone took the first bite. Napkins carried their own small expectations. A cloth napkin could be unfolded and placed in the lap, particularly during Sunday dinner or when guests were present. Paper napkins were common for everyday meals and might come from a dispenser, a decorative holder, or a stack beside the bread basket. Children were reminded that sleeves were not substitutes even when the napkin had somehow fallen to the floor. The napkin protected clothing wiped fingers and offered nervous hands something to fold during adult conversation. In more formal homes, reaching for it marked the beginning of proper table behaviour. In relaxed homes, it was simply necessary equipment when fried chicken, barbecue sauce, corn on the cob, or buttered bread appeared. One napkin was expected to last the meal unless a genuine emergency occurred. A child who used 3 before dinner began might receive an investigation into what exactly had happened. Setting the table created another burden for the person supervising dinner, because every object could become a mistake. A knife faced the wrong direction. 2 forks appeared at one place and none at another. A glass stood too close to the edge where experience suggested it had already chosen its fate. The salt shaker was empty. The napkins had been forgotten. These were small problems, but dinner was built from dozens of small problems solved before anyone noticed them. The polished image of family life depended on invisible corrections, wiping a spot from a plate, replacing a bent fork, finding an extra chair, moving the bread basket so everyone could reach it. In homes where girls were expected to help more than boys, table setting also reinforced unequal divisions of labour. One child might be sent outside while another remained in the kitchen learning the entire sequence. The tradition taught responsibility, but it also revealed which family members were expected to notice what everyone else needed. The arrangement changed when guests arrived. Better dishes came down from a high cabinet, serving spoons appeared from a drawer used less often, and cloth napkins might replace paper ones. A table leaf was added, followed by folding chairs, extra glasses, and the difficult calculation of where every person would fit. Children who normally set the table were given more detailed instructions because company dinner was not the evening for experimentation. Water glasses, coffee cups, dessert plates, and perhaps more than one fork made the surface look unusually crowded. The difference between everyday dishes and company dishes taught families that hospitality required visible effort. A guest was not expected to eat from a saucepan while standing near the stove. The table demonstrated welcome before the food did. Even when the meal was inexpensive, careful setting could make it appear generous, orderly, and special. As meals became more informal and family schedules separated, the fully set weeknight table became less automatic in many homes. Plates were taken directly from the cabinet when needed. Paper towels replaced napkins. Food was eaten at a counter on a tray, or in front of a screen where a knife and spoon might be unnecessary. This flexibility reduced preparation and cleanup, especially for households already short on time. Yet something subtle disappeared when the place settings did. A complete table anticipated the family before they arrived. It said there would be a chair, a plate, and a share of the meal waiting for each person. Once the forks and glasses were in place, the food still had to make its own transition. In many kitchens, dinner did not reach the table in the pot box or can in which it had been prepared. It was transferred into bowls, platters, and serving dishes, because presentation was another ordinary ritual that made supper feel complete. A saucepan could cook the vegetables, but it was not always considered fit to introduce them to the family. Before dinner reached the table in many homes of the 1960s and 1970s, food made one final transfer. Green beans were lifted into a serving bowl, mashed potatoes were smoothed beneath a pat of butter, gravy was poured into a small boat or pitcher, and sliced meat was arranged on a platter rather than left beside the stove. Even inexpensive food received this treatment. Canned corn might have travelled only a few feet from a paper-labelled can to an aluminum pan, yet it often completed the journey in a glass or ceramic bowl. The change did not improve the corn, but it changed the meal. Cooking vessels belonged to the work of the kitchen. Serving dishes belonged to the shared table. Moving food from one to the other was a small act of presentation, a way of saying that supper had finished being prepared and was now ready to become a family event. The serving dishes themselves formed a familiar household collection. There were heavy glass bowls, floral china platters, divided vegetable dishes, and oven-safe casseroles that could travel directly from the range or oven to the table. Pyrex and Corningware became especially useful because they blurred the boundary between cooking and serving without making dinner look as though the entire kitchen had been carried into the dining room. One bowl might be reserved for potatoes because its size was exactly right. Another held salad, although everyone knew it was too shallow and would lose a tomato slice if passed carelessly. A long platter waited for meatloaf, pork chops, fried chicken, or slices of roast. These pieces rarely matched perfectly. Some had been wedding gifts, some came from mothers or aunts, and others had been purchased one at a time when the household needed something large enough for Sunday dinner. Their value came from usefulness and repetition. A serving bowl became memorable because it appeared whenever the family did. Transferring the food required timing. Potatoes could not sit uncovered for long. Gravy needed to be poured before it thickened into something requiring architectural tools. Vegetables had to be drained without dropping half of them into the sink, and a hot casserole dish needed a trivet before it could touch the table. The cook often performed these tasks during the busiest minutes of the evening, while children searched for missing napkins and someone asked whether dinner was ready, despite standing close enough to observe the answer. A spoon was selected for every bowl. Butter was added to peas or corn. Parsley might appear when company was expected, lending a formal green confidence to food that had spent most of its life in a can. The final arrangement required judgment. Too much food in one bowl made passing dangerous. Too little in a large platter made dinner look smaller than it was. Presentation could not change the grocery budget, but it could help a modest meal appear complete. Serving dishes also concealed the machinery of convenience. A boxed side dish, a frozen vegetable, or a canned ingredient could arrive at the table, looking more homemade once the packaging disappeared. This did not necessarily involve deception. The box had already completed its useful role by providing instructions, measurements, and reassurance. It did not need to remain beside the plates advertising how much help dinner had received. A casserole might contain condensed soup packaged noodles or frozen broccoli, yet the finished dish belonged to the household once it emerged bubbling beneath a layer of cheese or crumbs. Moving food into family bowls gave the cook control over its appearance and portioning. Children did not study the package for serving suggestions or compare the photograph with reality. They saw what was placed before them. The modern product entered the kitchen, but the traditional serving ritual absorbed it. Convenience could assist with dinner. It was still expected to dress properly before coming to the table. The tradition also created more work. Every saucepan and baking pan still needed washing, and now the serving bowls joined them beside the sink. A one-pot meal could somehow produce 5 dirty dishes once the table was arranged. The person responsible for cleanup knew that presentation had a price. A serving spoon coated with mashed potato dried quickly. Gravy clung to the narrow corners of its dish. Warm glass bakeware had to cool before washing, while someone warned against placing it suddenly in cold water. In homes without dishwashers, the collection waited in a crowded basin until the family had finished eating. Even with a dishwasher, large platters and bowls occupied valuable space. The custom, therefore, reveals something easy to miss in nostalgic photographs. A carefully served dinner looked effortless only from the dining room side of the doorway. In the kitchen, someone had multiplied the washing to make the meal feel orderly. Not every household insisted on this distinction. Busy families sometimes placed a skillet, Dutch oven, or saucepan directly on a protective pad in the centre of the table. Farm meals, crowded kitchens, informal suppers, and dishes meant to remain hot could make cookware the most sensible serving vessel. A large pot of soup did not always need a second pot merely to improve its manners. Some families served plates at the stove, especially when portions had to be controlled or table space was limited. Cultural traditions also shaped whether food arrived in communal bowls, individual plates, baking dishes, or cookware. Yet the broader expectation remained recognizable. Ordinary meals often received some form of presentation before they were shared. The food was arranged, covered, garnished, sliced, or placed where everyone could reach it. The movement from stove to table gave dinner a visible beginning and allowed the person who had prepared it to present the whole meal at once. As weeknight eating became quicker and more individualized, food increasingly remained in the container that required the least additional work. A takeout carton could sit open on the counter. A microwave tray could become its own plate. Family members served themselves directly from storage containers, skillets, or packages, and carried food to different rooms. The change saved time, reduced dishes, and made practical sense for households eating in shifts. Still, the old serving bowls had performed more than a decorative function. They placed the entire meal in the centre of the family where everyone could see what had been prepared and what had to be shared. Once the potatoes, vegetables, bread and meat had reached the table in their separate dishes, the next ritual began almost automatically. Each bowl started a slow journey from one pair of hands to another, and every person had to take a portion while remembering that someone else was still waiting. The serving bowl began its journey with the person nearest the kitchen warm against two hands and heavier than it looked. Mashed potatoes, buttered corn, green beans, coleslaw, or sliced carrots moved slowly around the table, while each family member took a portion and passed the dish onward. In many homes of the 1960s and 1970s, this family-style service was so ordinary that no one thought of it as a tradition. It was simply how dinner travelled. A bowl did not remain in front of the person who wanted it most. It belonged temporarily to everyone. Children learned to hold it from underneath, keep the serving spoon from sliding onto the tablecloth, and send it in the correct direction without reaching across 3 plates. A heavy glass dish filled with hot vegetables could demand more concentration than the vegetables themselves. One careless tilt might send butter toward a sleeve gravy toward a placemat, or peas across territory they had never been invited to explore. Passing the food created an order within the meal. The main dish might begin with the adult who carved or served it, while side dishes moved from hand to hand until every plate contained some version of the same supper. In one family, bowls always travelled to the left. In another, no fixed direction existed, producing brief traffic jams when potatoes and green beans met between 2 uncertain children. Someone asked for the rolls while the bread basket was already moving away. The butter followed more slowly because one person had forgotten that it was a shared resource. These small delays required patience. A child could see the fried chicken, smell it, and still wait while an older relative selected a piece with ceremonial care. The ritual made hunger public but controlled. No one had immediate access to everything. Dinner depended on cooperation, and cooperation depended on the person holding the bowl remembering that the meal included other people. Portioning was part of the lesson. A child was often told to take a little first because second helpings could come later if enough remained. The instruction was practical in families watching the grocery budget, particularly when meat fresh produce or a special side dish had to serve a large table. Every scoop changed what was available to the next person. A deep spoonful of mashed potatoes might look harmless until the bowl reached the final chair nearly empty. Adults watch these calculations closely sometimes with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. Children learn to judge the size of a serving against the number of people still waiting. They also learn that the best piece of chicken, the corner of the casserole with extra crust, or the largest biscuit could not always be claimed simply because it arrived first. Taking food from a communal dish turned appetite into arithmetic, and family dinner was one of the places where that arithmetic became visible. The serving bowl also made preferences difficult to hide. A child who disliked peas could not pretend they had never appeared. The bowl arrived directly in front of the plate accompanied by a spoon, and usually an adult instruction to take some. Portions might be small, but complete refusal could interrupt the smooth movement of dinner. In many homes, children were expected to accept at least a little of each dish, whether they planned to eat it enthusiastically slowly, or through a complicated arrangement involving mashed potatoes. This expectation varied by household, and could become unnecessarily strict, especially when children were forced to finish food they genuinely disliked. Yet from the family's practical perspective, one meal had been purchased and prepared for everyone. The shared bowl made that fact impossible to miss. It carried not only vegetables but the cook's time, the grocery budget, and the household belief that dinner was not a collection of private orders. The person who had prepared the meal often watched the bowls more carefully than anyone else. A serving dish returning nearly empty could be satisfying unless it meant one person had taken too much before others were served. A bowl returning full suggested that the recipe had failed. The family was being polite, or everyone had quietly agreed to leave the canned beets untouched. The cook noticed which dishes moved quickly, which required reminders, and which stopped beside the same reluctant child each week. Refilling a bowl from the kitchen was possible, but it broke the rhythm and revealed that the original estimate had been too small. On nights when the budget was tight, there might be no refill. Bread, potatoes, gravy, or an inexpensive vegetable helped fill the table around a modest amount of meat. Passing each item ensured that everyone received a share, while also allowing the meal to look abundant in several separate dishes. Generosity at the family table was often carefully measured. Family-style serving varied across regions, cultures, and household arrangements. Some families placed all the food in the center. Others served plates in the kitchen so that portions could be controlled, children could be helped, or a crowded table could remain usable. In some homes, elders or guests were served first. In others, children received plates before the adults sat down. Certain dishes arrived communally while soup, salad, or dessert was portioned separately. Large holiday meals might use a buffet because no table could hold every platter at once. The tradition was therefore not one universal American method, but a recognizable pattern. Food appeared in a shared vessel, and access to it required attention to everyone else. The bowl connected the cook to the table and one person to the next. Even a silent meal contained this physical cooperation, hands receiving and releasing the same warm object. As dinners became more individualized, the serving bowl lost some of its nightly importance. Food could be plated at the stove, divided into microwavable portions left in take-out containers, or eaten directly from storage dishes by people arriving at different times. This reduced passing waiting and the risk of dropping hot corn into someone's lap. It also removed one of the table's quiet exercises in awareness. A communal bowl forced each person to consider how much existed, how many people needed it, and where it should go next. The ritual was ordinary, occasionally awkward, and surprisingly social. Once every bowl had completed its first trip around the table, another expectation became clear. The family might disagree about the vegetables, the seasoning, or who had taken the largest role, but the kitchen had prepared one dinner for the entire household. There was no second menu waiting behind the first. The kitchen did not take individual orders. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, one meal appeared at the table, and everyone was expected to find something on the plate they could eat. Meatloaf did not arrive beside a private hamburger for one child and a separate bowl of noodles for another. The household had purchased one set of groceries, heated one oven, dirtied one collection of pans, and planned one supper around the time and money available. A child might dislike the peas, an adult might avoid the gravy, and someone could quietly leave the onions at the edge of the plate, but the basic menu remained the same. This rule was not always announced because it seemed obvious to the person who had peeled, chopped, stirred, and timed the food. Dinner was a shared meal, not a restaurant with poor lighting and an unpaid staff. The menu usually began with practical limits. A family had one refrigerator, one stove, one grocery budget, and one person doing most of the cooking. Preparing several complete meals would have required more ingredients, more burners, more time, and more cleanup. Even convenience foods did not entirely remove those limits. A boxed noodle dinner might shorten the work, but it still occupied a saucepan. Frozen fish sticks needed oven space. Canned vegetables required heating, and hamburger patties still had to be shaped or separated. The cook planned combinations that could be completed together: baked chicken with potatoes and green beans, spaghetti with salad, and bread pork chops with applesauce, or a casserole with whatever side dish could be managed before the main pan finished. The menu was therefore less a statement of culinary authority than a solution to a household equation. Everyone had to be fed from the same kitchen before the food cooled and the evening moved on. Children often tested the rule with careful negotiation. One might ask whether the meatloaf could be served without sauce, whether the vegetables could remain on the other side of the plate, or whether bread and milk counted as dinner. Some requests were easy to accommodate. A portion could be removed before onions were added. Gravy could be passed separately, or a child could receive the end piece rather than the softer centre. Other requests threatened to create an entirely new meal, and that was where resistance usually began. "This is what we're having" became a familiar sentence because the alternative meant returning to the refrigerator and starting again. In stricter homes, refusal led to a long contest between child plate and cooling vegetable. In more flexible households, the child ate the acceptable parts and waited until breakfast. The boundaries differed, but the kitchen's basic position remained clear: preference could influence a portion, not redesign the evening. This one menu tradition also reflected the authority of the person who planned the food, although that authority came with a heavy workload. In many households, women were expected to remember everyone's preferences while still producing a meal that looked balanced, filled the family, and stayed within the grocery budget. A mother might know that one child disliked cooked carrots, another resisted anything with visible onion, and her husband preferred meat well done. She could adjust where possible, but each adjustment added another step. The cook was expected to make the meal personal without allowing it to become separate. That contradiction required experience. Onions were chopped smaller, a plain piece was set aside before sauce was added. The least popular vegetable appeared beside a more dependable potato. These quiet compromises rarely entered family stories, yet they reveal how much individual knowledge was folded into a meal that officially offered no choices. Not every household followed the rule in the same way. Allergies, illness, religious restrictions, cultural traditions, babies and older relatives could require different food. A child recovering from sickness might receive toast or soup, while the family ate something heavier. Families combining different ethnic or regional food traditions sometimes place several dishes on the table, allowing people to choose among them. In affluent homes, extra options were easier to provide, In households under financial pressure, choice narrowed because every ingredient had already been assigned a purpose. The rule could also feel unfair when adults rejected foods they disliked, while insisting that children eat everything served. For some viewers, the memory is comforting because it represents shared family meals. For others, it recalls tense evenings spent staring at a cold portion no one intended to finish. Both memories belong to the history of the same table. The shared menu taught children that dinner involved adjustment. They learned to eat around a disliked ingredient, combine foods to improve a flavour, or take a small portion first. Mashed potatoes concealed peas. Applesauce softened a dry pork chop. Bread rescued a plate when nothing else seemed trustworthy. Sometimes taste changed through repetition. A food rejected at age 7 became tolerable at 10 and strangely missed by adulthood. Sometimes the opposite happened, and a child's dislike proved permanent despite years of family effort. The important lesson was not always that every food had to be loved. It was that the meal had been prepared for a group, and each person's appetite existed beside everyone else's needs. The menu asked the family to share not only the food, but the inconvenience of not getting exactly what each person wanted. By the late 1970s and afterward, individual meals became easier to provide. Frozen entrees, wider takeout choices, countertop appliances, and eventually routine microwave use allowed one person to eat chicken, another pasta, and a third something reheated from the day before. Changing work hours and after-school schedules also made a single menu less practical when family members ate at different times. This flexibility solved genuine problems and reduced some of the conflict that once gathered around an unwanted vegetable. Yet it also changed the meaning of the cook's question. Instead of, "Are you ready for dinner?" the question increasingly became, "What do you want to eat?" The kitchen gained more choices but lost some of its shared certainty. On nights when the family still prepared one larger meal, the main dish sometimes arrived whole, a roast-baked ham or chicken placed on a platter, waiting for the carving knife and the person expected to use it. The roast arrived whole, carrying more ceremony than most weeknight food. A browned chicken rested on a platter with its legs tucked close, a baked ham gleamed beneath a sweet glaze, or a beef roast waited beside a small pool of juices while everyone watched for the carving knife. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, this was more likely to happen on Sunday during a holiday or when company came than on an ordinary Tuesday. The main dish had not yet become individual portions. It was still one large piece of food that had to be divided in public. Steam rose when the first cut opened it. The knife scraped softly against the platter. Children studied the process because the order of carving could determine who received a drumstick and end slice, or the piece with the most browned edge. Before the meal could be shared, someone had to turn one impressive object into enough portions for everyone at the table. The carving tools often appeared only when the meal deserved them. A long knife might be sharpened beforehand with several confident strokes against a steel, producing a sound that made the occasion feel more serious than the potato suggested. A two-pronged fork held the meat steady. Some families owned a special carving set stored in a fitted box received as a wedding gift, or saved in a drawer beneath less ceremonial utensils. Others relied on the sharpest kitchen knife available, whether or not it had been designed for the task. The platter needed room, so salt shakers, bread plates, and vegetable bowls were pushed aside. A hot roast could slide unexpectedly, gravy could escape toward the tablecloth, and a dull blade could turn dignity into prolonged sawing. The tradition looked graceful when illustrated in a cookbook. At an actual family table, it required concentration, elbow room, and relatives willing not to request a particular piece until the first slice had been completed. In many households, carving was associated with the father or another senior adult, especially during formal Sunday dinners and holidays. That role reflected traditional ideas about authority and hospitality, although family practice varied widely. The person who had seasoned the meat watched the oven basted it, tested it, prepared the side dishes and timed the entire meal might hand over the final visible task to someone who had just arrived at the table. Old advertisements often treated this arrangement as natural. Real families were less consistent. Mothers carved when they had the most experienced grandparents took over during large gatherings, and whoever owned the steadiest hand might be trusted with the bird. Sometimes the ceremonial carver was skilled. Sometimes everyone quietly accepted slices of remarkable thickness, because questioning the method would delay dinner. The knife carried prestige, but it also carried responsibility. A badly divided roast could leave the first plates generous and the final ones dependent on gravy. Carving made the grocery budget visible. A large piece of meat had to stretch across the entire table, and the person slicing it could see exactly how much remained. Thick slices looked generous but disappeared quickly. Thin slices travelled farther, especially when the meal included mashed potatoes, rolls, vegetables, stuffing noodles, or gravy. In larger families, children might receive smaller portions while adults were served according to appetite, age, or household custom. Guests were often offered the best pieces first, even when the cook knew those pieces were limited. A roast could therefore become an exercise in quiet calculation. The platter had to appear abundant while the knife measured the truth. One more slice might be possible if cut carefully. A chicken had only 2 drumsticks, 2 wings, and a limited amount of breast meat. Facts children understood with exceptional clarity. Family generosity worked best when everyone did not request the same part. The whole roast also created a centre for conversation. While carving continued, the table waited. Someone passed the vegetables, but attention remained on the platter. Questions about doneness, seasoning, and preferred cuts gave the meal an opening script. White meat or dark could organize the first several minutes of a chicken dinner. A ham produced debates over the glazed outside slices. A beef roast brought preferences for the pink center or the more cooked ends. These choices offered limited individuality inside the one-menu household. The family was not receiving separate meals, but each person could express a preference within the shared dish. Children learned the names of cuts without needing a diagram. They also learned that asking for the largest piece before guests were served was not considered strategic. The ceremony taught patience, hierarchy, and portioning while pretending to be only about meat. After dinner, the remaining roast continued to shape the household. Slices were wrapped in foil or wax paper, placed beneath a fitted lid, or stored on a plate in the refrigerator. Bones might flavour soup or stock. Chicken returned as sandwiches, salad, pot pie, or a casserole. Ham appeared at breakfast beside eggs, then reappeared in beans or scalloped potatoes. Roast beef could become hash-hot sandwiches with gravy, or lunch packed for work. The public carving at the table was only the first division. The cook was already considering how the leftovers would support another meal. In families, watching expenses, buying a larger cut made sense only if nothing useful was wasted. Sunday's impressive platter might quietly become Tuesday's practical supper. The tradition combined ceremony with thrift, turning one carefully purchased main dish into several different appearances across the week. Whole roasts became less central in many households as family size declined, schedules separated, and smaller cuts or quick cooking portions fit weeknight life more easily. Boneless chicken pieces, hamburger patties, frozen entrees, take-out meals, and individually packaged foods required no ceremonial knife. They cooked faster, divided predictably, and allowed family members to eat at different times. Large roasts never disappeared, especially at holidays and Sunday gatherings, but their role changed. For many families, carving became an occasional performance rather than a weekly responsibility. The old platter still returns at Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, or a reunion, and someone still asks who is going to cut the meat. Around that centerpiece waited the foods that helped every slice go farther. Bread rested in a basket, butter softened in its dish, and glasses of milk stood ready to fill the edges of the meal. The bread basket often reached the table before the main dish was completely settled. Slices of white sandwich bread, dinner rolls, biscuits, cornbread, or pieces cut from a grocery store loaf waited beneath a folded napkin, with a butter dish close enough to begin moving as soon as grace ended. Beside them stood glasses of milk, sometimes poured from a carton in the kitchen, and sometimes filled from a pitcher that made an ordinary meal look slightly more formal. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, these foods were not decorative extras. They filled the spaces around the meat, vegetables, and potatoes, made modest portions feel more complete, and gave children something familiar when the main dish inspired doubt. Bread, butter, and milk were the quiet, supporting cast of family dinner. They rarely received the praise given to a roast or homemade dessert, yet their absence could make the table seem unfinished. Bread helped stretch the meal because it was inexpensive, filling, and acceptable to nearly everyone at the table. A child who disliked the casserole might still eat a slice of bread with butter. An adult returning hungry from physical work could add another roll without asking the cook to produce more meat. Gravy left on the plate could be gathered with bread rather than wasted, although manners determined whether this was done neatly with a fork or enthusiastically by hand. In some households, sliced white bread appeared at nearly every supper, still in the plastic bag until the last moment. Other families preferred homemade biscuits, yeast rolls, rye bread, tortillas, cornbread, or regionally familiar loaves. The form varied with culture, geography, income, and family tradition, but the practical purpose remained recognizable. Bread gave the meal insurance. If the portions were small, the vegetables unpopular, or the teenager unusually hungry, the basket helped close the gap. The butter dish carried its own household rules. Butter might be softened on the table before dinner, making it easy to spread across warm bread, or remain firm enough to tear a slice into several pieces during the attempt. Margarine was common in many homes and could appear in a tub on a small plate, or shaped into a stick that looked formal once removed from its wrapper. Families chose according to cost, habit, taste advertising, and what the grocery budget allowed. Children were reminded not to dig into the center, leave crumbs in the dish, or take enough for an entire bakery. The butter knife belonged to everyone, which meant it was supposed to return to the dish, rather than disappear beside one plate. A warm roll with melting butter could make canned vegetables and a thin slice of meat feel more generous. It was a small pleasure, but ordinary family meals often depended on small pleasures performing steady work. Milk played a different role. In many households, children were expected to drink it with dinner, whether they considered it refreshing or simply unavoidable. A glass might stand beside every young place, setting white against the coloured plastic tumblers and patterned dishes of the period. Some adults drank milk as well, while others preferred water, iced tea, coffee, or another household beverage. Fresh milk could be a significant grocery expense for a large family, especially when it was also needed for breakfast cereal, cooking, school lunches, and snacks. Powdered or evaporated milk sometimes served as backup ingredients, but the dinner glass usually came from the fresh supply when available. Parents watched how much was poured because an overfilled glass invited disaster, and because the carton had to last. One child's second glass could become tomorrow morning's cereal shortage, a domestic consequence rarely considered by the person asking. The presence of milk also reflected a period when family meals were often described as needing certain dependable components. Cookbooks, school lessons, public health messages, and food advertising encouraged households to think in terms of balanced plates, even though the exact foods and the ability to provide them varied widely. Meat or another main dish, vegetables, bread, and milk formed a recognizable arrangement in many homes. The meal did not have to be expensive to look complete according to those expectations. A small serving of meatloaf, canned green beans, mashed potatoes, bread with margarine, and a glass of milk could be presented as a proper family supper. That appearance mattered to parents trying to feed several people on limited money. The table suggested abundance through variety, even when each item had been selected because it stretched well. Bread filled the stomach, milk added substance, and potatoes made the meat appear less lonely. These staples also created some of the meal's most persistent childhood negotiations. A child might ask to fill up on bread before touching the vegetables. An adult might limit rolls until the main food had been eaten. Milk had to be finished, but not necessarily in one dramatic swallow at the end. Spilled milk interrupted conversation instantly because it travelled faster than any family member could react. Napkins were pressed into service plates were lifted, and the child responsible sat frozen while the white stream found the edge of the table. Buttered bread created crumbs that gathered beneath placemats, and later appeared on the floor where the family dog had often been waiting with professional patience. These were not grand traditions, but they made the table feel lived in. The bread basket moved, the butter-softened glasses emptied, and the ordinary meal became a sequence of familiar actions. As eating patterns changed, bread, butter, and milk did not vanish, but their automatic place at every dinner weakened. Families became more varied in their diets, meal structures, and ideas about what belonged on the table. Take-out meals arrived with their own sides. Individual portions were reheated without a bread basket. Some households stopped serving milk at supper, while others replaced sliced bread with foods connected to different cultural traditions or personal preferences. The supporting foods became choices rather than fixed parts of the meal. Yet many people still remember the comfort of a warm roll passed across the table, the small square of butter melting into it, and the cold glass waiting beside the plate. Those simple items filled more than the edges of dinner. They filled pauses, stretched budgets, calmed picky eaters, and made the table look ready. Once everyone had taken what they needed, however, another object waited nearby with growing power over the evening. The television screen, which in many homes was expected to remain dark until dinner was finished. The television set might be only one room away, glowing behind a doorway, or waiting silently in a wood-grain cabinet, but during dinner it was expected to lose the argument. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, the evening meal created a temporary boundary around the table. The news, a favorite comedy, a baseball game, or a children's program could be important, but the family was supposed to finish eating before returning to the screen. A parent might lower the volume, switch the set off entirely, or close the cabinet doors as though putting the outside world away for half an hour. From the dining room, everyone could still hear the faint click of cooling tubes, the refrigerator motor, and silverware touching plates. The silence was not always peaceful. Without television filling the room, children had fewer places to hide their boredom, adults had to make conversation, and every unfinished vegetable remained clearly visible. Yet that was precisely the point. Dinner was meant to hold the family's attention before the television reclaimed the evening. Keeping the screen off required planning because television followed a schedule just as firmly as supper did. Programs did not wait for viewers' pause during dessert or begin again whenever the dishes were cleared. A family that wanted to watch something at 7 had to put dinner on the table early enough to carry plates to the sink and reach the living room before the opening music. This could turn the supper hour into a quiet race. The cook calculated backward from the television listings, although no one called it that. A casserole went into the oven at the proper time. Children were summoned from outdoors before their favourite show began. Coffee might be postponed, and dessert could be served later in front of the set if the schedule became too tight. The television was forbidden from controlling dinner, but it often influenced the meal from a respectful distance. A program beginning in 20 minutes could make an entire family eat green beans with unusual efficiency. The rule was never universal. Television dinners had already made eating near the screen familiar, and many households enjoyed occasional tray meals as a novelty or practical solution. Folding television trays could appear in the living room, each holding a frozen entree sandwich bowl of soup or plate carried carefully from the kitchen. Saturday evenings, major sports events, election coverage, holiday specials, and favourite programmes could suspend the usual arrangement. In small apartments or homes without a separate dining area, the television might be visible from the table whether anyone wanted it to be or not. Some families watched the evening news while eating because it matched the parents' arrival from work. Others treated television as background sound no more disruptive than the radio had been. The remembered tradition was therefore not that every American screen went dark at supper. It was that many families recognized dinner as one of the few times when turning it off could still be demanded and defended. Parents often explained the rule as a matter of conversation. Dinner was where school notices surfaced, workplace complaints were translated into family language, and tomorrow's plans were negotiated over potatoes. A television voice made these exchanges difficult because everyone's attention tilted toward the same corner of the room. Children answered questions without looking away. Adults stopped mid-sentence when something dramatic happened on screen. The meal became quieter, but not more attentive. With the set off, family members had to notice one another. That did not guarantee meaningful conversation. Some dinners involved long pauses, repeated questions about homework, or a parent reading the newspaper, despite insisting that television would be rude. Yet the table still offered the possibility of exchange. A child might reveal a school problem while asking for more bread. A family decision could emerge between the main course and dessert. The television supplied stories from outside the home. Dinner was expected to make room for the smaller stories happening inside it. For children, the dark screen could feel like an unnecessary test of loyalty. A favourite programme might already be starting, and every additional bite seemed to delay escape. The child nearest the living room listened for theme music and attempted to identify the programme from a few distant notes. Eating quickly created another problem because table manners still applied. Food had to be chewed, milk could not be swallowed in one desperate effort, and asking to be excused before everyone finished might be refused. The television, therefore, turned ordinary dinner into a contest between appetite manners and broadcast time. Siblings encouraged one another to hurry, then blamed the slowest eater when the opening scene was missed. Parents could respond with the devastating reminder that television was a privilege, not an emergency. The program continued without them, which may explain why so many adults remember lost beginnings with greater clarity than the meals that caused them. The rule also protected the labour behind supper. Someone had planned the menu, shopped for ingredients, prepared the food, set the table, and tried to make several dishes arrive warm at once. Allowing everyone to stare past the meal at a television could make that work disappear. Turning off the screen required the family to look at what had been prepared, and occasionally at the person who prepared it. This expectation could become overly formal or controlling, but it also expressed a belief that dinner deserved attention. A meatloaf might not compete successfully with a Western, a variety show, or a championship game, so the competition was removed. The family did not have to praise every dish. They simply had to be present for it. In households where the cook spent much of the day performing work that was rarely recognized, An uninterrupted meal offered one small acknowledgement that supper was more than fuel collected on the way to the living room. By the late 1970s and in the decades that followed, the boundary weakened as screens multiplied and meals became easier to carry. Portable televisions, cable programming video recorders, microwavable food, and later personal devices reduced the power of one shared schedule. A family no longer had to choose between dinner and missing a program in quite the same way. Ironically, greater control over television did not always return everyone to the table. It made separate viewing and separate eating easier. The screen moved from one cabinet in the living room to kitchens, bedrooms, counters, and eventually individual hands. Many families still preserve screen-free dinners, but the rule now often has to be stated deliberately because the technology no longer waits in another room. In the older household, one screen could be turned off with a single click. Another interruption was harder to silence. Mounted on the kitchen wall, resting on a hallway table, or ringing sharply beside the refrigerator, the family telephone could demand attention in the middle of the meal, even when no one intended to answer it. The wall telephone could ring with enough force to interrupt every conversation at the table. Mounted beside the refrigerator attached to a hallway wall, or resting on a small stand near the kitchen doorway, it announced itself with a metal bell that was difficult to ignore and impossible to silence politely. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, dinner created one of the few moments when a ringing telephone might be allowed to continue unanswered. Everyone heard it. Everyone knew that someone was calling, yet the family was eating, and that fact could temporarily outrank curiosity. Forks paused while the first ring sounded. Eyes shifted toward the kitchen. By the second ring, a child might begin rising from the chair, only to be told to sit back down. The caller could try again later. Unless the family was expecting important news, the telephone was supposed to wait just as the television had waited. Dinner had gathered the household, and an unseen person on the other end was not automatically invited to enter. Ignoring the telephone required more discipline than ignoring a quiet screen. The ringing repeated at regular intervals, filling the spaces between sentences and making everyone imagine who might be calling. Perhaps it was a relative, a neighbour, a doctor's office, a child's friend, or someone from work. Before answering machines became common, there was no message waiting afterward, and no simple way to know whether the call had mattered. The mystery made each ring more persuasive. Parents sometimes gave in after the third or fourth bell, pushing back a chair and walking quickly toward the wall phone with the napkin still in hand. The receiver was lifted and the answer was often brief. The family was having dinner. Could the caller phone again later? This statement was not necessarily rude. It informed the caller that they had reached the household during protected time. The telephone had connected American homes more closely, but dinner etiquette attempted to keep that connection from controlling every minute of the evening. The location of the phone made privacy difficult. Kitchen wall telephones were convenient because someone could stir a pot watch children or make a grocery call while remaining near the centre of the house. They also meant that dinner conversations and telephone conversations occupied the same space. A coiled cord might stretch several feet, allowing the person answering to step into a hallway pantry or corner near the basement stairs, but the family could usually hear at least one side of the exchange. Children listened while pretending not to. Adults lowered their voices for serious news, which only made the rest of the table listen harder. A long conversation beside cooling food could attract increasingly obvious looks. The caller could not see the casserole drying at the edges, or the family waiting with forks in hand. The person holding the receiver had to end the conversation through tone alone, repeating that this was not a good time while the cord twisted around one wrist. Children faced a stricter version of telephone etiquette. Friends who called during dinner were often told that the child could not come to the phone. In some homes, the parent answering would ask who was calling why, and whether the matter could wait, turning a simple invitation into a small interview. The child at the table might whisper instructions from across the room and receive a warning to stop. If permitted to answer, the conversation was expected to remain short. A detailed discussion of homework, neighborhood plans, or who had said what at school did not justify leaving the meal. Teenagers tested this boundary more seriously. A call from a friend could feel urgent even when it concerned nothing more important than evening plans. The family, meanwhile, watched the teenager stand beside the phone, speaking in a carefully casual voice, while the gravy cooled. Dinner reminded young people that the household still claimed their time, even when the telephone offered a private world just beyond the table. There were practical reasons not to answer. Once a person left the table, the meal's rhythm changed. Serving bowls stopped because someone was missing. A question had to be repeated. The caller might keep the person away long enough for everyone else to finish. In households where the cook also answered the telephone, the interruption added one more responsibility to an evening already full of tasks. She might leave her plate, take a message on a pad beside the phone, locate a pencil that actually worked, and return to find someone requesting more milk. Business calls, school messages, church arrangements, and family news often reached the home during the same hours when supper was being served. The telephone promised convenience, but it also made the household permanently reachable. Allowing it to ring during dinner was one small way of saying that availability had limits. The rule protected not only conversation, but the right to finish a hot meal before attending to another demand. Of course, some calls had to be answered. Families waiting for news about illness, travel, employment, military service, or a relative in trouble did not let the phone ring casually. Parents working irregular hours might call home during a brief break. A teenager away from home was expected to report a change of plans. In rural areas or communities where neighbors depended closely on one another, a call could carry urgent information. Some households also shared party lines in earlier years, adding another layer of etiquette and limited privacy. The tradition was never a simple ban. It was a judgment made with incomplete information each time the bell sounded. The family had to decide whether the unknown caller mattered more than the known people already sitting at the table. Most evenings the answer was no. Occasionally one sentence from the receiver changed the mood of the entire room. As answering machines, cordless phones, caller identification, mobile phones, and later text messages became common, the dinner interruption changed form. Families gained the ability to screen calls, return them later, or carry the conversation away from the kitchen. Yet the telephone also became harder to leave outside the meal because it no longer belonged to one wall. It travelled in pockets and rested beside individual plates. The old wall phone rang for the whole house, and one decision determined whether it would be answered. Modern devices can interrupt each person separately and silently, which makes the boundary less dramatic but more difficult to enforce. In the earlier kitchen, once the caller had been ignored or dismissed, the family returned to dinner and then to the work that followed it. Plates had to be carried away, crumbs brushed from the table, and children who had helped set the places were expected to remain useful when the meal was over. The meal did not end when the last bite disappeared. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, children who had helped place forks and glasses before supper were expected to remain useful afterward. Plates were carried carefully toward the kitchen. Serving bowls were lifted from the table, and drinking glasses were collected before anyone could escape to the television homework or the neighborhood outside. The work was rarely described as a family tradition. It was called helping, doing your part, or simply what happened after dinner. A child learned quickly that standing up from the table did not mean freedom. It meant looking for something to carry. One plate could be balanced in each hand if the child was trusted. Younger helpers received the bread basket napkin holder or salt and pepper shakers objects selected, because dropping them would create inconvenience rather than disaster. The route from table to sink was short, but it marked the final stage of the shared meal. Clearing the table required more judgment than children first realized. Scraps did not always go directly into the trash. Bones might be saved for stock meat returned to the platter and leftover vegetables placed in small refrigerator dishes. Bread went back into its bag or bread box before it dried. Butter returned to the refrigerator unless the household kept it covered on the counter. Milk had to be put away quickly, especially in a warm kitchen. A child carrying plates might be told not to stack them, because gravy beneath one plate could spread to the bottom of another, creating more washing. In other homes, stacking was encouraged because it reduced the number of trips. The rules depended on the person supervising the cleanup, and that person often had a complete system that everyone else was expected to understand without explanation. A fork left beneath a napkin, a glass forgotten near the far end of the table, or a serving spoon carried away with the leftovers could reveal that the helper had not yet mastered the evening inspection. At the sink, the work divided again. One person scraped plates while another washed, rinsed, or dried. Before dishwashers became common in every household, a basin of hot, soapy water waited beneath a window that might already be dark. The person washing began with glasses and silverware, then moved toward plates, bowls, and greasy pans. Children standing beside the sink dried each item with a cotton towel and returned it to a cupboard whose shelves seemed much higher when both hands were occupied. A wet glass could slip. A plate could be placed in the wrong stack. The towel grew damp long before the work was finished, and someone was accused of drying too slowly or leaving water spots. In households with an automatic dishwasher, children still had duties scraping food loading racks, adding detergent, or putting clean dishes away later. The machine reduced part of the labour, but it did not carry a casserole dish from the table or locate the missing spoon beneath a chair. These chores taught children the geography of the kitchen. They learned which drawer held the serving utensils, which cabinet accepted everyday plates, and which dishes were too delicate to handle without supervision. They discovered that plastic cups went on one shelf, coffee mugs on another, and the good serving bowl did not belong wherever there happened to be room. Repetition turned storage into memory. A child who complained about cleanup could still replace 6 different objects without asking where they went. The work also taught the less pleasant facts of family dinner. Mashed potatoes hardened along the edge of a bowl. Egg yolk resisted casual washing. Grease floated on dishwater, and dried oatmeal from breakfast sometimes remained in the sink, as evidence that household labour had no respect for separate meals. The table had presented dinner as a complete event. Cleanup revealed all the individual objects required to create that appearance. Responsibility was not always divided fairly. In many families, daughters were expected to set the table, clear dishes, wash, or dry more often than sons. Boys might be assigned outdoor work, trash removal, or occasional heavy lifting, while girls remained in the kitchen beside their mothers. These patterns varied across class, region, culture, and household, but they reflected broader expectations about who should learn domestic work. A girl drying plates was often described as preparing for adulthood. A boy performing the same task might be praised for helping, as though the kitchen were temporary territory. Older siblings carried more responsibility than younger ones, and the child considered most reliable could become permanently responsible for the least popular chore. The tradition taught cooperation, but it also passed household roles from one generation to the next. Some children remember the work as ordinary companionship beside a parent. Others remember watching brothers disappear toward the television while they remained with the dish towel. Cleanup also created a quieter space for conversation. The table had held the whole family, but the kitchen after dinner often held only 2 or 3 people. A parent washed while a child dried, both facing the sink instead of one another. That position made certain subjects easier to mention. A school problem, a disagreement with a sibling, or a request for permission could emerge between the plates and the silverware. Advice was given while leftovers were covered. Family news was interpreted while crumbs were brushed into one hand. The work provided conversation without requiring eye contact, and the steady sequence of washing and drying filled awkward pauses. Not every clean-up was warm. Arguments continued, children complained, and tired parents demanded that the work be finished properly. Yet even irritation became part of the ritual. The person drying knew the sound of each plate touching the stack, and the exact moment when the final pan meant release. When everything had been cleared, the table itself received attention. Crumbs were gathered with a damp cloth. Placemats were shaken and a vinyl table covering was wiped, until no sticky ring remained beneath the drinking glasses. Chairs were pushed back into position. The floor might be swept around the places where children had eaten, especially if bread, corn, or peas had travelled downward during the meal. The kitchen lights reflected on a surface that had been crowded only minutes earlier. Returning the room to order closed the evening's domestic circle. The same table that had been prepared before dinner was now empty and ready for breakfast, homework, sewing bills, or tomorrow's grocery list. Family meals occupied the room for only part of the day, but the labour before and after them extended far beyond the time spent eating. As schedules changed and meals became more individual, cleanup became individual as well. One person carried a microwave plate to the sink. Another left a takeout carton on the counter. Disposable packaging reduced washing, while dishwashers and smaller meals made a full family cleanup line less necessary. Children still received chores in many households, but the shared sequence of setting, eating, clearing, washing, and drying became less automatic. Something practical was gained. Fewer dishes, quicker evenings, and less repetitive labour. Something communal weakened as well. Helping after dinner reminded children that a meal did not simply appear and disappear. It required work on both sides of the table, and while hands remained busy with plates and towels, the conversation often continued preparing the family for another tradition, the daily report of schoolwork neighbours and small troubles delivered between the main course and dessert. The first report often arrived before the serving bowls completed their second trip around the table. A parent asked what happened at school, and the answer began with the traditional nothing despite 8 hours of evidence to the contrary. Another child mentioned a spelling test only after being asked directly. Someone had been moved to a different seat. A teacher had announced a field trip, or a note waited inside a book bag beneath several less important papers. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, dinner served as the household's daily information exchange. There were no text messages during the afternoon, no electronic school portals, and no family group chat quietly collecting updates. News travelled home inside lunchboxes, coat pockets, briefcases, and memory. Once everyone sat together, the table became the place where those separate days were compared. The potatoes moved clockwise. The questions moved wherever an adult suspected useful information might be hiding. Children did not always welcome this attention. The dinner table could feel like a small interview conducted while chewing. How was the test? Did you turn in the assignment? Why had the neighbour called? Where was the permission slip? A child who hoped to keep a poor grade hidden discovered that parents had developed several methods of investigation. One question led to another. A sibling supplied a detail that had not been requested. The attempt to redirect the conversation toward the biscuits failed. Good news could be difficult to deliver as well, especially when modesty was expected. A child might mention a high grade casually while reaching for milk, pretending the information had no greater importance than the salt. The table gave achievements, disappointments, discipline and embarrassment the same ordinary setting. Important news did not always arrive with a formal announcement. It surfaced between bites because that was when the family was finally in one room. Adults brought their own reports, although they were often less complete. A parent returning from an office shop, hospital, factory, construction site, store or farm might describe traffic equipment trouble, a difficult customer changing hours, or a co-worker's strange decision. Some details were considered unsuitable for children and were reduced to a tired expression or the statement that it had been a long day. Other stories became regular dinner entertainment. Families learned the names of co-workers they had never met and could recognize which supervisor had caused trouble from the tone of the first sentence. In households where one parent spent the day at home, the report might include a repairman who did not arrive, a grocery price that had increased, a sick child laundry defeated by rain, or news gathered from a neighbor across the fence. Domestic work generated its own events, although they were not always treated with the same importance as paid employment. Dinner could reveal that imbalance whenever one person's day received questions and another person's labor remained assumed. Neighborhood information also traveled across the table. A family heard that someone was moving, a new baby had arrived, a relative was visiting, or a nearby house had finally been sold. Church announcements, school fundraisers, sports schedules, club meetings, and community events entered the conversation because they affected rides, meals, money, or the use of the family car. In smaller towns and close neighborhoods, dinner reports could include details gathered from the grocery store, beauty shop, barber, workplace, porch, or telephone. Not every story was generous, and family tables could become efficient places for gossip. Children learned which information was public, which was private, and which could be repeated only if they wished to create a serious problem. The evening report did more than describe the day. It taught the family how to interpret the people around them whose behavior deserved sympathy, and whose latest decision would be discussed until dessert. The table also served as a planning desk. Tomorrow's appointments were announced. Someone needed lunch money. A child required poster board, clean gym clothes, or a ride after school. A parent would be home late, so dinner needed adjustment. The car needed gasoline before an early departure. Saturday chores were assigned before anyone could claim ignorance. These details might seem small, but the household depended on them. A forgotten announcement could leave a child standing after practice, or send a parent to a closed store looking for supplies needed the next morning. Dinner gathered the information while there was still time to act. A pencil and calendar sometimes appeared after the plates were cleared, but much of the planning remained verbal. Family members were expected to remember what had been said. The meal organized not only the present evening, but the next day, one request and reminder at a time. Conversation was not always warm, equal, or voluntary. Some tables were dominated by one adult, while children spoke only when questioned. Political opinions, money problems, report cards, and family conflicts could make the meal tense. A child might wait until the safest moment to ask permission for a weekend activity, hoping that dessert would improve the answer. Parents sometimes disagreed about discipline in front of everyone. Silence could become more noticeable than conversation, especially after an argument. Other families avoided difficult subjects, entirely keeping the talk on whether school work and who needed more potatoes. The nostalgic image of dinner as effortless connection leaves out these uncomfortable meals. Yet even tension demonstrated the table's importance. People argued there because decisions were made there, authority was visible there, and no one could easily leave without being noticed. The daily report weakened when family members stopped beginning dinner together. A teenager eating before work missed the parent arriving later. A child carrying a plate to the television gave shorter answers. An adult reheating food after everyone else had finished heard the day's stories second-hand if at all. Telephones and later digital messages made practical updates easier to deliver, but they did not always reproduce the wandering conversation in which one small detail led to another. Many families still ask about school and work at dinner, yet the practice now often has to compete with separate schedules and screens resting beside the plate. The older table created conversation simply by keeping people present long enough for silence to become uncomfortable. Weeknight reports connected one day to the next, but once each week a larger meal often connected the household to relatives' church and family history. Sunday dinner required more food, more chairs, and an afternoon arranged around the table. Sunday dinner announced itself long before anyone sat down. A roast browned in the oven chicken pieces crackled in a heavy skillet, or a pot of beans simmered while the house filled with the smell of onions, coffee yeast rolls, and something sweet cooling on the counter. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, Sunday dinner was larger, slower, and more deliberate than the meals served during the working week. It might be eaten at noon in the middle of the afternoon, or during the early evening, depending on church schedules, farm work, family distance, and local custom. The name could be confusing to outsiders. In some regions, dinner meant the main meal served after church, while the later meal was called supper and might consist of sandwiches, leftovers, or cake with coffee. Whatever the hour, Sunday dinner held a special position. It gave the family one meal that was not supposed to feel improvised, even when the cook had been working since breakfast to create that appearance. The preparation often began on Saturday. A cake was baked, beans were soaked, vegetables were cleaned, or a chicken was cut and seasoned before the Sunday clothes were laid out. Sunday morning itself could require careful coordination. Food had to cook while the family attended church, visited relatives, or completed chores that did not observe the weekend. A roast stayed in a low oven. A covered casserole waited to be reheated. In some households, a pressure cooker or electric skillet helped shorten the work after everyone returned home. By the 1970s, slow cookers offered another solution, allowing a meal to remain warm while the family was away. Yet no appliance removed the planning. Rolls still had to be baked, gravy, finished vegetables heated, and the table extended if relatives were expected. The tradition was called Sunday rest, but the person responsible for feeding everyone often experienced a day of carefully disguised labor. The menu varied enormously across regions and families. Southern tables might hold fried chicken, ham, greens, macaroni and cheese, cornbread, beans, or sweet potatoes. Midwestern households could serve pot roast, baked chicken, mashed potatoes, gravy corn, and a gelatin or fruit salad. Italian-American families might gather around pasta sauce, meatballs, sausage bread, and dishes prepared in quantities large enough to feed relatives who had not clearly confirmed whether they were coming. Jewish Sunday meals, Catholic family gatherings, black church communities, immigrant households, rural farm families, and urban apartment dwellers each brought different foods and meanings to the day. Some meals reflected deep cultural traditions. Others were built from supermarket meat, canned vegetables, boxed mixes, and whatever the grocery budget could support. There was no single national Sunday dinner, but many shared the same ambition, to place enough food on the table that the week briefly looked generous. Relatives gave the meal its scale. Grandparents married children, cousins, a widowed aunt, or a family friend might arrive carrying a pie, a bowl wrapped in foil or nothing more than an appetite, and several hours of conversation. Extra leaves were fitted into the table. Folding chairs came from the basement or hall closet. Children were assigned to a smaller card table, where they ate from less fragile plates, and developed a social order separate from the adults. The house grew louder with coats on beds, voices in doorways and serving dishes crowding every available surface. Sunday dinner could strengthen family bonds, but it could also reopen old disagreements with remarkable efficiency. Politics, money, discipline, marriage, and absent relatives were all available for discussion. The table held affection and tension at the same time. People might argue over something important, then pass the gravy without acknowledging the change in subject. For children, Sunday dinner carried a different rhythm from the weekday meal. They might be dressed more carefully, warned about their manners, before guests arrived and instructed not to touch the dessert cooling near the stove. The meal took longer because adults talked between courses and no one seemed concerned that children had already finished. A favourite cousin could make the waiting enjoyable. An unfamiliar older relative could turn it into an endurance test. The food itself might be more appealing than the weeknight menu, especially when fried chicken, homemade rolls, mashed potatoes, or a special cake appeared. Yet Sunday dinner also included dishes children were expected to respect, because someone had spent all morning preparing them. Refusing an aunt's casserole or a grandmother's vegetable carried risks beyond ordinary dislike. At the Sunday table, food was attached to people. Accepting a small serving could be less about appetite than diplomacy. The meal helped carry families through the week in practical ways. A large roast ham chicken or pot of beans produced leftovers for Monday lunches and later suppers. Slices were wrapped for sandwiches. Bones and drippings were saved. Cake remained beneath a cover, becoming the reward after school until only crumbs and hardened frosting remained. Sunday dinner could therefore justify its expense by continuing to feed the household after the guests had gone. It also gave relatives a regular opportunity to exchange information, check on older family members, discuss jobs, arrange childcare, and plan the next gathering. Before frequent long-distance calls became affordable for every household, and before messages travelled instantly, the weekly meal carried family news face-to-face. A person's health, mood, or financial trouble could be noticed across a table in ways that a brief telephone conversation might not reveal. The tradition was never easy for every household. Restaurant workers, nurses, police officers, factory employees, military families, farmers, and others working Sundays often could not gather at the expected hour. Some families lacked money for a larger meal, lived too far from relatives, or experienced Sunday gatherings as obligation rather than comfort. The labour also fell unevenly. Women frequently prepared, served, and cleaned, while other family members treated the meal as their day of rest. Nostalgia can make the table appear effortless, but the empty roasting pan and crowded sink told a more accurate story. Sunday dinner created connection because someone invested time, skill, and energy in making connection possible. As weekends filled with sport shopping, shift, work travel, and separate activities, the weekly meal became harder to protect. Families still gathered for birthdays and holidays, but many no longer assumed that every Sunday belonged to the table. Brunch takeout restaurant meals and flexible schedules replaced some of the old routine. Yet the memory of Sunday dinner remains powerful because it joined food to the calendar. The smell of roast chicken or sauce did not merely announce hunger, it announced what day it was and who might soon come through the door. For many families, the weekly religious calendar shaped another meal as well. Before Sunday's larger table arrived, Friday could bring fish macaroni tuna casseroles and meatless suppers governed by a different kind of tradition. On Friday afternoon, a can of tuna, a box of frozen fish sticks, or a saucepan waiting for macaroni could announce the day as clearly as the calendar. In many Catholic American homes of the 1960s, Friday supper was organized around abstaining from meat. Beef, pork, and chicken stepped aside while fish, eggs, cheese, beans, and meatless casseroles took their place. The meal might be fried fish with potatoes, tuna noodle casserole beneath a layer of crumbs, grilled cheese beside tomato soup, or macaroni and cheese served with peas and bread. Children did not always understand the religious reasoning, but they recognized the menu. The smell of fish in the kitchen, the sight of tuna being folded into noodles, or the repeated appearance of a cheese dish told them that Friday had rules. These meals were not universal across American families, and Catholic households varied by ancestry, region, income, and personal practice. Yet for many, the religious week reached directly into the refrigerator and decided what could be placed on the table. The rule demanded creativity because a family still expected dinner to be filling. Fish could cost more than inexpensive cuts of meat, especially far from the coast, and fresh seafood was not equally available in every community. Frozen filets, canned salmon, tuna, fish sticks, and packaged seafood offered practical alternatives. A cook could stretch one can of tuna through noodles, condense soup peas, and a casserole dish large enough to suggest abundance. Salmon patties combined canned fish with crumbs, egg, and seasoning before being browned in a skillet. In some homes, eggs and fried potatoes became supper. Others relied on bean dishes, cheese sandwiches, vegetable soup, or pancakes when the household preferred not to make fish the center of the meal. The religious restriction removed certain choices, but the grocery budget removed several more. Friday cooking became a weekly exercise in finding something meatless that would satisfy adults, children, and anyone who believed fish should not look too much like fish. Regional traditions gave Friday meals different smells and textures. In coastal communities, families might prepare locally familiar seafood rather than a frozen substitute. In parts of the Midwest and Northeast Church, fish fries brought families into parish halls where battered fish potatoes, coleslaw bread, and coffee were served beneath bright basement lights. Italian-American households might prepare pasta with tomato sauce, seafood, vegetables, or cheese. Families with Polish, Irish, German, French, Mexican, or other Catholic backgrounds carried their own meatless dishes into the weekly routine. In Louisiana and other areas with strong seafood traditions, abstaining from meat did not necessarily make supper feel limited. Elsewhere, Friday fish could be an obligation accepted with less enthusiasm. One child remembered crisp fried fillets and lemon. Another remembered a square frozen portion whose interior seemed to have only a distant relationship with the ocean. Religious observance was shared, but appetite remained personal. The meal also influenced restaurants' lunch counters and school cafeterias, because families accustomed to Friday abstinence created regular demand for meatless choices. Fish sandwiches, fried seafood plates, grilled cheese tomato soup, and macaroni dishes gave diners an alternative when the usual hamburger or meat entree did not fit the day. At home, however, the person planning dinner still carried most of the responsibility. She had to remember the calendar while shopping, keep the appropriate ingredients available, and answer the child who wanted to know why the family could eat chicken yesterday but not tonight. Some parents offered a religious explanation. Others delivered the shorter household version: it was Friday. Children learned that certain rules did not require a new debate every week. The tuna can opened the noodles boiled, and the casserole entered the oven with the confidence of a tradition that expected cooperation rather than applause. The practice changed significantly in the United States near the end of 1966. American Catholic bishops ended abstinence from meat as the single legally required form of Friday penance outside Lent, while continuing to recommend voluntary Friday abstinence and other acts of penance. The change was easily misunderstood. Friday did not suddenly lose all religious meaning, and the familiar rules remained more specific during Lent. Yet many families experienced the new flexibility through food. A household that had automatically planned fish every Friday could now choose another form of observance outside the Lenten season. Some continued the old menu because habit identity and preference were stronger than the changed rule. Others quickly allowed meat back onto the Friday table. Parents who had grown up under the earlier discipline sometimes maintained it, even when their children understood that exceptions had become possible. Official practice changed in a document. Household practice changed one grocery list at a time. That gradual transition made Friday supper a meeting place between generations. Grandparents might still expect fish without discussion. Parents could feel that abandoning the meal meant losing something larger than a rule. Children growing up in the 1970s might know Friday fish mainly during Lent at a church supper or when visiting older relatives. The same tuna casserole could therefore mean obedience to one person, convenience to another, and nostalgia to someone who had once complained about it. These meals also reveal how religious traditions survived by attaching themselves to ordinary sensory memory. A theological explanation might fade, but the smell of fish frying in oil, the crunch of crumbs on baked macaroni, or the cold sweetness of coleslaw beside a hot fillet remained. The calendar had entered the kitchen so consistently that decades later, one familiar plate could bring back an entire Friday evening. Friday fish and meatless casseroles never truly vanished. They remain important during Lent in parish communities, in culturally specific households, and among families who continue voluntary abstinence throughout the year. What declined was the broad expectation that an ordinary Friday would automatically produce a recognizable meatless family supper. Changing religious practice, more varied diets, restaurant choices, and fragmented schedules loosen the connection between one weekday and one category of food. The tradition became seasonal or personal, rather than nearly automatic in many Catholic homes. Yet while Friday dinner showed how belief could shape an everyday menu, another tradition showed how hospitality could transform the entire room. When guests were invited, ordinary plates returned to the cupboard, serving pieces were polished, and the good dishes finally came down from the shelf where they had waited for company. The good dishes lived above ordinary life. They waited on the highest cupboard shelf inside a dining room hutch, or behind glass doors where children could see them, but were strongly discouraged from proving they could reach them. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, everyday meals were served on durable plates that tolerated hurried breakfasts, tomato sauce chipped edges, and years of dishwashing. Company dinner was different. When relatives, neighbors, a minister, a supervisor, or friends from church were expected, the better plates came down. They might be wedding china with a gold rim, floral dishes purchased one place setting at a time, or a complete set received from parents when the household was established. Matching cups appeared with matching saucers. Serving bowls emerged from tissue paper. The meal had not changed yet, but the room already had. Good dishes told the guests that their arrival mattered enough to reorganize the cupboard. Preparing them could begin hours before the doorbell rang. Plates stored for months collected a faint layer of dust and had to be washed, dried, and inspected beneath the kitchen light. Silverware was polished if it had darkened. Water spots were removed from glasses, and a tablecloth came from a drawer smelling lightly of starch or cedar. Cloth napkins might be ironed and folded, although paper napkins remained perfectly acceptable in many less formal homes. The table leaf was added. Chairs were carried from other rooms, and the best serving pieces were arranged according to a plan known mainly by the person doing the work. A gravy boat needed a small plate beneath it. The butter dish required its proper knife. Coffee cups could not appear before dessert unless space allowed. Company dinner involved feeding people, but it also involved managing objects. Every plate and spoon became part of the household's public appearance. The distinction between everyday dishes and company dishes often began with marriage. Department store registries, bridal showers, relatives, and wedding gifts helped couples assemble formal tableware that might have been too expensive to purchase all at once. A place setting represented adulthood hospitality and the expectation that a household would eventually entertain. Some families added pieces over the years, a platter at Christmas, extra cups from an anniversary gift, or replacement plates found after one broke. Other households inherited dishes from mothers, grandmothers, or aunts, giving the table a history older than the marriage hosting the meal. Not every family owned fine china, and many created the same sense of occasion with their best available set. A matching collection from a discount store could be treated with as much care as an expensive pattern. Good did not always mean costly. It meant protected, complete, and reserved for moments when ordinary dishes seemed insufficient. Children understood the danger immediately. They were told to carry one plate at a time, use both hands, and avoid leaning anything against the edge of the table. A child trusted with good dishes felt briefly promoted and deeply threatened. Breaking an everyday plate produced irritation. Breaking a wedding plate could become family history. Younger children might eat from sturdier dishes even while adults used the formal set, especially if experience suggested that gravity would be attending dinner. At the table, everyone behaved with greater awareness. Knives did not scrape as loudly. Cups were returned to saucers rather than placed wherever space appeared. A child who usually pushed peas into elaborate formations discovered that the decorated border of a company plate offered fewer hiding places. The dishes did not create good manners by themselves, but they made mistakes feel more visible. Formal objects could turn an ordinary child into a careful guest inside the child's own home. The food also dressed for company. A weeknight casserole might be served directly from its baking dish, but guests could inspire a browned roast glazed ham, fried chicken arranged on a platter, or vegetables placed in matching bowls. Garnishes appeared with confidence. Parsley, orange slices, lettuce leaves, or a dusting of paprika assured everyone that the cook had considered the appearance from above. Rolls rested beneath a cloth, butter was shaped neatly, and dessert waited on a stand or special plate rather than remaining in the pan. The menu did not need to be extravagant. Families often stretched affordable ingredients through casseroles, gelatin salads, potatoes, bread, and homemade cake. The goal was generosity, or at least its convincing appearance. A host wanted guests to feel that enough food existed even when the refrigerator held carefully measured leftovers, and the grocery budget had already experienced the event. Company dinner placed enormous pressure on the person responsible for the meal. The house had to be cleaned, the bathroom inspected, children warned food, timed coffee prepared, and conversation maintained while nothing burned. The good dishes increased the clean-up waiting at the end. Delicate plates might be washed by hand even in homes with dishwashers. Gold trim, painted decoration, or sentimental value made automatic washing seem too risky. After guests left, the host and perhaps one or two family members stood at the sink drying each piece before returning it to storage. Tissue paper was replaced between plates. Cups went back onto hooks or shelves. A serving platter had to be fitted into a cabinet designed by someone who had never attempted the task after midnight. Hospitality looked calm from the dining table. Behind the kitchen door, it was an extended operation with no convenient ending. Guests also altered the family's social behaviour. Children were instructed to greet people, properly answer questions, and avoid discussing private matters at the table. Adults selected conversation carefully, especially when the visitors came from work, church, or the neighbourhood. Family disagreements were temporarily covered as neatly as the casserole beneath foil. A guest received the preferred chair, the first serving, and often the best piece of meat. Compliments were accepted modestly even when the cook had spent 2 days hoping to hear them. The good dishes helped stage this performance of welcome. They created a temporary version of the household that was more polished, coordinated, and patient than the one seen on ordinary evenings. This did not necessarily make the hospitality false. The effort itself was sincere. A family used its best objects to show respect, even when everyone returned to chipped plates and unfinished arguments the next day. As entertaining became more casual, formal dinnerware lost some of its authority. Families met at restaurants, ordered pizza, served buffet-style meals, or invited friends into kitchens where mismatched plates caused no concern. Smaller homes and changing tastes made complete china sets less desirable, while younger generations often inherited cabinets full of dishes they rarely used. Many good sets survived but remained stored so carefully that they missed most of family life. That is the gentle contradiction inside the tradition. The dishes were protected because they mattered, yet their protection kept them absent from thousands of ordinary meals that later became the memories people valued most. Still, when company arrived, bringing out the good plates made hospitality visible before anyone tasted the food. The next celebration could be more personal and less formal. On a birthday, one family member might be allowed to choose the entire dinner, turning an ordinary home-cooked meal into a gift no restaurant menu was required to provide. The birthday child did not always choose a restaurant. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, the special privilege was choosing what the family would eat at home. The request might be fried chicken spaghetti with meat sauce hamburgers cooked in a skillet meatloaf with mashed potatoes, pork chops with applesauce tacos, a favorite casserole or macaroni and cheese prepared exactly the way one parent made it. The meal did not need to be expensive or impressive to feel important. Its value came from recognition. For one evening, the household menu bent toward a single person's taste. A child who usually accepted whatever appeared on the table could name the main dish request a particular vegetable, and sometimes choose the dessert as well. The kitchen still did not become a restaurant, but the birthday created one annual exception, in which preference carried ceremonial weight. The decision often began several days earlier. A mother or father asked what the birthday child wanted, and the answer could arrive immediately because it had been considered for weeks. Some children chose a meal rarely served because it required extra work or cost more than the usual weeknight supper. Others selected something completely ordinary because familiarity mattered more than novelty. A plate of homemade fried chicken might carry the memory of summer picnics. Spaghetti could mean a large bowl in the center of the table, grated cheese passed around, and permission to eat more than one helping. Hamburgers prepared at home might be accompanied by potato chips, baked beans, sliced tomatoes, or pickles arranged on a plate. The request gave the cook a clear assignment, but it also created pressure. A birthday meal had to taste like the remembered version. Improvisation was risky when the guest of honor had been waiting all year for a particular gravy. The grocery trip became part of the celebration even when the child did not accompany it. Ingredients that might normally be considered unnecessary appeared in the cart. A preferred soft drink, better cut of meat, special ice cream or decorative candles joined the ordinary bread milk and canned vegetables. Families watching expenses planned carefully. A favorite meal could be made generous with potatoes, roll salad, gelatin, or a homemade cake rather than restaurant prices. The birthday child might receive the largest chicken piece, the first hamburger from the skillet, or the slice of meatloaf with the browned edge. These privileges were small enough to fit the budget but visible enough for everyone to understand. The meal said that the person mattered not because the household had spent extravagantly, but because someone had remembered exactly what would make the plate feel personal. The cake carried its own expectations. It might come from a boxed mix or from a recipe card marked with frosting stains, but it was usually finished in the family kitchen. Chocolate yellow white spice coconut or angel food cake appeared beneath buttercream, cooked frosting, whipped topping, or a glossy layer made from whatever recipe the household trusted. Decorations ranged from careful piped borders to coloured sugar scattered with determination. A child's name might be written across the top in icing that began confidently and ended smaller as space disappeared. Candles were counted, placed lit and protected from younger siblings, who believed blowing them out was a shared responsibility. The cake did not need to look like a bakery window. In fact, a slightly uneven layer or one leaning candle often made it more memorable. The family recognized the hands behind it. Birthday dinner could also reveal the difference between childhood desire and adult practicality. A child might request a combination that made little sense as a complete meal, such as hot dogs, mashed potatoes, canned peaches, and chocolate cake. The cook then tried to create order without weakening the privilege. One vegetable was added, bread appeared, milk was poured. The birthday child received the chosen foods, while everyone else received enough familiar structure to call the result dinner. Siblings sometimes objected, especially when the meal favoured something they disliked. They were reminded that their own birthday would arrive. This annual rotation offered a simple lesson in family attention. One person could be centred without becoming the only person at the table. Everyone ate the chosen meal, sang the song, watched the candles go out, and accepted that tonight belonged more fully to someone else. The tradition was not identical in every household. Some families celebrated with restaurant meals, especially as dining out became more affordable or convenient. Others held large parties with relatives, neighbours, paper hats, decorated tables, and several children running through the house. In homes with limited money, the birthday meal might be the only special observance, making the chosen dish especially important. A parent working late could postpone the celebration until the weekend. A child with several siblings might share a party or receive a smaller cake. Cultural and regional traditions shaped the menu from noodles and dumplings to barbecue enchiladas, seafood stews, or family recipes connected to grandparents. The deeper pattern was not one particular food. It was the act of turning a known preference into a household event. The birthday was celebrated through the familiar language of the family kitchen. As restaurant dining, takeout delivery, and themed parties became more common, the home-chosen birthday meal lost some of its automatic place. Many families still preserve it, but the question increasingly shifted from, "What should I cook for your birthday?" to, "Where do you want to go?" Eating out reduced work for the household and offered wider choices, especially when several people wanted different things. Yet the old tradition carried an intimacy that no printed menu could fully reproduce. The cook knew how brown the edges should be, how much sauce belonged on the spaghetti, and which piece of chicken the birthday child hoped to receive without asking. A chosen home meal was both food and evidence of being known. After the candles were blown out and the cake plates emptied, the family often remained at the table longer than usual. Coffee was poured, stories continued, and the celebration lingered in the space between the last crumbs and the moment the chairs finally moved. The plates might be empty, but the meal was not necessarily over. Coffee began to pour into cups, dessert plates appeared, and chairs remained occupied, while the kitchen settled into a quieter rhythm. In many American homes of the 1960s and 1970s, family members did not immediately scatter after the last bite of supper. A pie was cut beneath the ceiling, light slices of cake were passed around, or canned peaches and cookies provided a simpler ending. Adults refilled their coffee while children waited to see whether seconds of dessert would be permitted. The serving bowls had stopped moving, but conversation continued across the table that had gathered everyone an hour earlier. Someone leaned back carefully in a familiar chair. A spoon touched the side of a cup. The refrigerator hummed beyond the doorway. Remaining at the table allowed dinner to become something larger than eating. It became the part of the evening when no one had an urgent reason to stand up yet. Dessert did not appear every night, and when it did, it could be modest. A square of sheet cake, rice pudding, gelatin, fruit, cocktail ice cream, or cookies from a package was enough to extend the meal. Sunday dinner might end with apple pie, coconut cake, banana pudding, cobbler, or another family specialty prepared before the main dishes occupied the oven. On an ordinary weeknight, dessert could be the last slice of yesterday's cake divided with careful geometry. Children understood that dessert followed the meal rather than replacing it, although many conducted private research into possible exceptions. They watched adults finish coffee and calculated whether another cookie remained unclaimed. The final course slowed everyone down because it did not require the same practical attention as passing potatoes or cutting meat. The work of hunger had ended. What remained was taste conversation and the small luxury of staying seated. Coffee gave adults a reason to linger even after children had finished. It might come from a percolator that had been working on the counter, sending its dark rhythm through a glass knob, or from a pot prepared as the dinner dishes were cleared. Cups and saucers appeared, sometimes matching the everyday plates and sometimes drawn from a separate set. Cream and sugar travelled around the table, accompanied by the familiar questions of who took what. One person preferred it black. Another added enough milk to change the colour completely. A visiting relative stirred for so long that the spoon seemed to become part of the conversation. Coffee marked a gentle shift in authority. Children could remain, but the pace now belonged to adults. Stories grew longer. Work problems became more detailed. Relatives discussed people the children only partly recognized. The table that had required manners during the meal became a place where adults could settle into themselves. The conversation often wandered because no one was trying to complete a formal agenda. A story about school could lead to a memory from a parent's childhood. A remark about grocery prices could become a discussion of someone's first job. Plans for Saturday opened into questions about who needed the car, who would visit a grandparent, and what had to be purchased before the stores closed. At larger family dinners, the same stories returned repeatedly. An uncle described an event everyone had heard before, but the details changed slightly with each telling. A grandmother corrected him from the other end of the table. Children absorbed family history without being told that history was being taught. They learned who had once lived in another town, which relative had been considered difficult, and how a familiar recipe had entered the household. The stories were rarely organized, yet together they explained where the family believed it had come from. Lingering also created room for quieter matters. A parent could ask an older child about a decision after younger siblings had left. Two adults might discuss money in lowered voices while pretending the children still present were not listening. A relative who needed help could mention the problem slowly after coffee had been poured, and the room felt less formal. Family disagreements sometimes softened once the serving dishes were gone. At other times, the extra minutes gave an argument more space to grow. Staying at the table did not guarantee warmth. Some children remember being trapped beside an empty plate, while adults talked far beyond the limits of childhood patience. Others remember the comfort of listening without responsibility, drawing circles in cake crumbs while familiar voices moved around them. The tradition held both experiences. Conversation could feel like belonging, instruction, delay, or all three during the same evening. The household work continued around those who lingered. Someone carried cups to the sink, wrapped the remaining pie, wiped the counter, or covered a plate for a family member arriving late. In many homes, the person who had cooked dinner could not remain seated for the entire conversation. She moved between table and kitchen, listening from the doorway, while putting food away and filling the dishpan. Guests might offer to help and be told to remain where they were, although the offer could be repeated until accepted. Children were sent to change clothes, finish homework, or prepare for bed, but their voices still drifted back into the dining room. The family meal dissolved gradually rather than ending at one clear moment. First the main dishes disappeared, then the children, then the coffee cups. Finally, only two people might remain beneath the light, finishing a conversation that had begun while the potatoes were still warm. As family schedules became more divided, the long after dinner pause became harder to preserve. One person needed to leave for work, practice homework, or an evening appointment. Coffee travelled into the living room. Dessert was eaten later or skipped. Plates were cleared quickly so the table could become a desk bill-paying station or surface for tomorrow's preparations. Television, take-out microwave meals, and separate eating times did not eliminate conversation, but they removed the automatic interval in which everyone had already gathered and had nowhere else to be. Lingering became something reserved for holidays, restaurants, reunions, and visits from relatives, rather than an ordinary conclusion to supper. The change saved time, especially for households carrying more complicated responsibilities. It also meant that some stories no longer had enough quiet minutes to begin, and that may be what connected all 20 traditions: the fixed supper hour, the empty chair, the washed hands, the prayer, the familiar seat, the carefully set table, the serving bowls, the single menu, the carving knife, the bread basket, the dark television screen, the ringing telephone, the children clearing plates, the daily report, Sunday dinner, Friday fish company dishes, birthday meals, and coffee after dessert, all created time around food. Not every family followed them. Not every memory is comforting, and the labour behind these meals was rarely shared equally. Yet the traditions gave ordinary objects a role in holding people together: a wall clock above a formica counter, a warm glass bowl moving from hand to hand, a recipe card stained at one corner, and a chair that seemed to belong to someone forever. Some customs truly faded. Others survived in quieter forms, returning when relatives gather and everyone instinctively waits before beginning. The old family dinner was never perfect. It was simply one of the places where ordinary life paused long enough to be remembered.